The psalmist said, "Lord, I love the place where your glory abides." We're blessed with such a place, the sanctuary that was rebuilt in 2006, and the glory of the Lord surely abides there. We've experienced the glory of the Lord in uplifting music, in timely messages, in baptism, in communion. We've experienced the presence of God in high moments like Easter Sunday, confirmation, weddings, but also in those darker, more difficult moments. Good Friday, Tenebrae, memorial services, funerals. At Westside, we are blessed with that beautiful sanctuary, and God's glory abides there. But look at the sanctuary that we're worshiping in today. Can you see the glory of God all around you? Can you hear it in the cricket? Can you see it in the grass, even in those critters that are crawling through the grass? Can you see it in the trees and the bushes around us? Can you see it in the blue sky and the sun that is behind me and in front of you? Can you feel the coolness when the clouds cover that sun for just a little? Didn't that feel good? We're hoping for a little bit more of that. Can you see the glory of God in the birds that are making their way around us? Are you awake to the presence of the Lord in creation? Can you see the glory of God in the cucumbers, in the tomatoes, in the flowers, in the corn, in the green beans that are growing in our community garden? I'm so glad, and this was not planned, I promise you, that today's sermon was the story of Moses and the burning bush on Mount Horeb. How good is that? A reminder that God does not simply meet us in the temple, in the sanctuary. Time and time again, we see it in the scripture. Abraham, outdoors. Paul, Saul, outdoors. Moses, outdoors. The outdoor sanctuary. And it's worth noting on Labor Day weekend, it's important to remember he was met by the Lord when he was doing his job, his work. He met God at work. Can you imagine meeting God at your work? But that's what happened. He was tending his father-in-law Jethro's sheep, and he experienced God in the work, in the manual labor that he was doing. I think it's worth remembering that on Labor Day weekend. But here's what I want to explore today. This text is a foundational text in the Judeo-Christian tradition, but today what I want to look at, it's the foundational text that marries the importance of the contemplative life and the active life in Christian spirituality. There is no distinction between spirituality and mission, prayer and politics, contemplation and action. That connection is too often forgotten, and sometimes it's denied, sometimes with clever arguments. Maybe you've said these things yourself. Maybe you still believe that. Faith should be about prayer and spirituality. It should never be about politics. Maybe you believe that. This story has something else to say. Or maybe you're the kind of person that says faith is all about doing things. It's about action. All that contemplative talk and that prayer and spirituality, it's just a whole bunch of navel gazing. Maybe you believe that. This story has something to say to you. It has something to say about the connection between these things. And it is the job of the prophets of this world, like Jesus, as Richard Rohr says, to remake this connection between contemplation and action, a connection that is forgotten too often and denied. The truth is, action without contemplation, contemplation without action, lacks fruitfulness and generativity in life. But remaking this connection unleashes a power greater than ourselves, a power that changes the world. And that's what we see right at the beginning with Moses. He's committed to intimacy with God and at the same time committed to political engagement with the world. Moses is committed to the inner journey, the interior life, and the exterior journey. He's in this intimate conversation with God, which continues throughout his life and ministry. He's slowly learning to trust God. He's slowly learning to surrender his will to God's will. It's a process, but he's engaged in that process. And at the same time, he's willing to lead. He's willing to engage in political action, social movements on behalf of God's intentions, faithful to God's call. You might even say his prayer life drives him to action, and his active life drives him to prayer. You feel the energy? That's what it's intended to do. The work is supposed to bring you to your knees. And when you're at your knees, you're supposed to surrender your ego, your will, to that purpose of God that is greater than you, greater than me. Gay read today, when the Lord saw that Moses had turned aside to see. When the Lord saw that Moses turned aside to see, then God addressed Moses personally. Rabbi Lawrence Kushner says this is not a miracle story. It was a test. God was testing Moses to see if he could pay attention to something longer than 1 or 2 minutes. Could he pay attention to the more than human world and God's presence in it? And when Moses demonstrated to God, yes, I can, then Moses speaks, or God speaks. And once they are in conversation, Moses discovers this is holy ground, and he took off his shoes. You can take off your shoes today. No one will complain. My shoes are off. You can take them off. Feel the grass on your feet if you'd like. Elizabeth Barrett Browning says in her poem, "Earth is crammed with heaven, and every common bush afire with God, and those who learn to see take off their shoes." Those who learn to see take off their shoes because they're on holy ground. We're on holy ground all the time, but do we know it? Do we see it? Do we feel it? This has been a growing connection with West Side Story 2.0. We were thinking about where God was calling us, and we realized that the outdoors is the neglected space on our campus and in our lives. We coined a phrase, West Side Outside. You're going to hear more about that. And we've encouraged this community to do more activities outside. Not only to honor the fact that God is present here, but to honor the reality that increasingly this is the common space. This is the shared space. Going in there is intimidating for a lot of people who aren't part of the community. It's interesting, when we built the sanctuary, we let the outside in, natural lights, right? The chapel, wide open, these windows connected to the outdoors. Maybe the call of this next generation is to bring the inside out. To bring what we do in there out here to the common meeting space, to the sanctuary that we all can experience and we've all come to know. But there are other reasons why we need to be outdoors. Health reasons. So many of us are indoors way too much. I can even feel it today. Like our relationship with the outdoors is hostile. Bugs, sun. It's a little bit hostile. Why is that? We are of the earth. This is us. This is our home. We should feel at one. We come into the world. Our children don't have a hard time going outdoors. Why is it that we start to have this hostile relationship with nature? We're suffering from nature deficit disorder. And science is beginning to demonstrate, and hopefully as it becomes more sophisticated, it can demonstrate it even more deeply, that this, not being out here, affects our physical health. We can't be healthy if we're indoors all the time on our devices. We got to get into the outside spaces. But it's deeper than that. It not only affects our mental health, our physical health to get outside, but also our spiritual health. You've heard me share this story, but it bears repeating, of this little boy who would go into the woods every morning, and his father was kind of concerned. Why is my son going into the forest by himself? He was worried for his safety. And so he inquired of his son. He said, "Son, what are you doing when you go into the woods?" And he says, "I go to pray, to be with God." His father said, "You know that God is everywhere. God is the same here as there." And the little boy said, "Yeah, I know that, Dad. I know that God is the same, but I'm not. We're not the same when we're outside. We're just a little more accessible. We're a little more vulnerable. We're a little more open to being met by the divine. God is the same, yeah, here and in there, but we aren't the same." The poet Tess Gallagher says you can't go deep until you slow down. You can't go deep until you slow down. Nature helps us to slow down. Our bodies get back in touch with the natural rhythms of creation. And when we're slowed down and we experience the power of slowing, we can go deep. We can have that intimacy with God that we're all longing for, but we often don't make time for. This leads to the second part of this story. When Moses slows down and he pays attention and he notices things, God not only speaks to Moses, but God reveals God's heart to Moses. And God reveals what's breaking God's heart. God says, "I've observed the misery of your people. I know your suffering. I've heard your cries." You see, when Moses pays attention, he realizes that God is paying attention all the time. God is aware of the injustices in our world, and God's heart is breaking at the injustice in our world. How important to remember that on Labor Day weekend, a federal holiday created to lift up the achievements of working people and the prosperity that they have built for all of us, but also to celebrate the labor movement, which emerged in response to injustice. Listen to the conditions that led to the labor movement: long working hours, poor working conditions, inadequate wages, the same issues that the Israelites were experiencing in Egypt. God's not concerned with politics? Are we kidding? God says to Moses, "I'm on the side of the slaves, not the slaveholders. I'm with the Israelites who are being abused and oppressed, and I'm not on the side of the taskmasters who are doing the abusing and the oppressing." And God is saying, I'm not going to stay silent and quietly uphold an unjust status quo. No, I'm going to call people like you, Moses, and many others like you, to bring the powerful to their knees and to lift up the lowly and the oppressed. Labor Day weekend. There's a community garden behind us, and I've been thinking about this garden. It is so Presbyterian. Let me explain. Presbyterian theology teaches that the church does not exist for itself. We are a missional organization. We exist to serve the world. Now, we all get fed from being here, and all that stuff is beautiful. Bible study, prayer, all that stuff is beautiful. Choir. But we do it in service to the world. Well, this community garden, guess who's going to enjoy these vegetables? Now, the kids today may have a little taste, and that's okay. But this is being offered to the hungry, the people who don't have access to healthy food. And so much of the food in food pantries is unhealthy food. It creates all kinds of problems. It may solve the hunger problem, but it creates health problems. This food is healthy, and it's given away. It is in service to the world's need, a powerful reminder for us as the church. But it goes even deeper than that, because any gardener knows there's this intimate relationship between contemplation and action. A skilled gardener, and I'm not speaking for myself, but we do have a couple skilled gardeners around here, carefully selects seeds, plants them in fertile soil, and waters them diligently. A skilled gardener knows that seeds need time to root and sprout, even as they also need the gardener's consistent attention and care. The gardener's wisdom lies in knowing when to nurture the growth through stillness and when to foster it through active care. In the same way, our spiritual journeys require us to find that balance between contemplative moments where we nurture the intimacy with God, where we engage in this holy conversation and we seek God's wisdom and grace, as well as those active moments when we engage and we do what is ours to do. We engage the world socially and politically. We take the steps that God is calling us to take. And when contemplation meets action and spirituality marries politics and prayer and mission are in harmony, our lives can and will and do bear fruit or vegetables for the world. Our lives bear fruit because we're staying connected to a source greater than ourselves, and we are staying connected to that source as we do what is ours to do. We cultivate a personal relationship not only with God, but with the suffering of the world, our suffering and the world's suffering, and our hearts begin to break for the things that break God's heart, and our lives are increasingly being offered in service to the things that God cares about, that matters most to God, and we become like the burning bush, blazing with power and passion, but not consumed and not burning out. Blazing with passion, but not burning out. That's the place that Jesus calls us to. And that can only happen when we nurture the contemplative life and the active life. When St. Francis was praying in San Damiano, he heard Jesus speak to him in the sanctuary from a crucifix. And Jesus said, "Go rebuild my church, which is falling down." And you know what he did first? He took it literally. He rebuilt San Damiano Church. It needed rebuilding. He did it. He got a lot of other people to help. And then he realized that Jesus was calling him to something deeper and broader. That Jesus wanted to rebuild the global church that had lost its way, that was no longer concerned with the injustices of the world and was no longer standing with the poor and the oppressed and didn't see the presence of God in the lepers of this world. And he decided to be faithful to that call. And you know what he did? He took the church outside. He taught the Christians to see Christ in people, the lowest of the lowliest, and in brother sun and sister moon and all the creatures. He taught people to see God in the more than human world. He rebuilt the global church. And do you know St. Francis has more written about him in history than even Jesus himself? He spoke to a hunger, and I would submit to you that that hunger is alive and well. And this is the place where we can meet people, for God is present here, and we're all just a little more vulnerable outdoors than we are indoors. At the end of St. Francis's life, on his deathbed, he looked up and he said, "I have done what is mine to do." I love those kids' voices. "Now you go and do what is yours." So what is yours to do? In a moment, Liz is going to lead us in some time of reflection, but let me offer this poem by Maya Hayes to help you enter into that question. What, Lord, am I called? What is mine to do? She writes, "In nature's embrace, I find my way, where the winds whisper and trees sway. A burning bush, ablaze and bright, calls me to heed its holy light. I hear the rustling leaves, the gentle streams. They tell me life is more than dreams. Within their song, a truth unfolds, a purpose whispered as nature molds. Just as the stars find their place above, I find my call, a task to love. With courage born of wind's caress, I'll journey forth through each trial's test. In fields and forests, mountains high, I'll heed the call that fills the sky. A symphony of purpose, clear and true. I'll answer, Lord, with all I am and do.